What if a single moment of awareness, born in the darkness of a world that did not forgive mistakes, was the only reason your ancestors survived long enough for you to exist today? Before fire became a constant companion, before language shaped warnings, and long before spiritual beliefs took form, early humans relied on something far more primal, an instinct that felt like a whisper from the unseen. Imagine standing barefoot on cold earth 700,000 years ago, hearing nothing but wind and distant cracking branches, yet sensing that something was wrong before anything actually happened. Why did these early humans feel danger in their bones long before their eyes confirmed it? Could that subtle pull, that inner tightening, be considered the first spiritual protection that kept the earliest tribes alive? As the first bands of humans moved through vast, unpredictable landscapes, survival depended not only on strength or speed, but on a mysterious awareness that science still struggles to fully define. Their world was filled with predators that hunted silently, storms that arrived without mercy, and territories where one wrong step meant a swift end. Yet somehow, these tribes developed a heightened perception, a kind of spiritual radar that seemed to activate when the unseen drew near. Was this protection something they learned from nature, or something that nature placed inside them long before they even understood it? The truth is that our ancestors lived in a state of constant alertness, but not the anxious kind we know today. It was deeper, instinctive, almost sacred. Their senses stretched far beyond vision and sound. Vibrations in the ground, changes in the air, the sudden stillness of birds, the way fire shifted its direction, even the behavior of shadows at dusk. All these elements created messages, not spoken messages, but patterns that the first tribes interpreted as guidance. They believed the invisible world was not empty. It was alive, attentive, and capable of protecting those who listened with discipline and humility. And perhaps, without realizing, they were right. If you have ever felt something warn you before you understood why, or sensed danger before it revealed itself, you might have touched a very old memory. A memory that connects you directly to those ancient humans who relied on intuition as their first form of spiritual communication. And as we dive deeper into this journey, understanding how those early tribes felt, interpreted, and survived these unseen forces becomes essential to understanding ourselves as well. Before we continue, tell me in the comments if you have ever experienced that sudden instinct that made you change direction or hesitate for no obvious reason. Your insight matters here, so leave a comment, drop a like to support the content, and take a moment to check if you are already subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the next part of this journey. Now, let us move forward, keeping that same sense of ancient awareness alive as we explore what came next. That ancient awareness did not fade as the tribes moved through their harsh world. It expanded. Once a faint whisper, it began to shape how early humans interpreted every sound, every movement, every shift in the environment. Long before structured rituals or spiritual symbols existed, the ability to sense danger before it arrived became a silent partner in their survival. Imagine walking through the Paleolithic landscape, where the boundary between safety and death could be the distance of a single footstep. For these early humans, recognizing the unseen was not a matter of belief, but a matter of necessity. Their minds were constantly decoding signals, many of which they could not fully understand but instinctively obeyed. When a predator lurked behind tall grasses, its presence rarely announced itself with noise. Instead, the ground might vibrate differently, or the faint rustle of leaves would stop, too suddenly. Early humans did not wait for visual confirmation. Their bodies reacted first, tightening muscles, slowing breathing, widening perception. This early form of feeling the future was not magical. It was the result of generations living so close to danger that the mind rewired itself to detect patterns long before they became obvious. They learned that danger had a rhythm, a temperature, a silence that betrayed more than sound ever could. This heightened sensitivity extended to the group as well. When one member sensed something, others responded almost instantly, as if a shared awareness connected them. These early tribes operated like a single organism, with fear and perception flowing through them collectively. That unity allowed them to act faster than many predators expected. Their reactions were swift, precise, practiced, not because they had training, but because survival left no room for hesitation. Over time, this constant vigilance evolved into something deeper. They began to trust not only what they could see or hear, but what they felt. Their instincts became a compass guiding them through forests, across plains, and along riverbanks where danger often hid in plain sight. Even the wind carried meaning. A sudden change in its direction was enough to alter their path. Shadows lengthening too fast, birds falling silent at the wrong hour, the distant echo of cracking branches that did not fit the usual rhythm of the landscape. These were messages. Their world spoke constantly, and they learned to interpret every whisper. What outsiders might view as superstition was, for them, a survival mechanism shaped by thousands of life and death encounters. This sensitivity created the foundation for what would later evolve into spiritual interpretation. Before calling anything a sign, omen, or protection, early humans simply recognized patterns that kept them alive. And these early experiences of anticipating danger shaped their perception of an invisible world guiding their steps. As the tribes continued to depend on this inner and outer awareness, the boundary between instinct and something spiritual became thinner, preparing the ground for a new layer of meaning that would soon define their nights and shape their belief in forces that seemed to walk beside them in the darkness. As the tribes continued to navigate a world where every step held the possibility of threat, their growing awareness began to take on another layer, one that extended beyond instinct and entered the realm of meaning. In time, certain individuals within each group began to stand out. These were not necessarily the strongest or the fastest, but those who noticed more, reacted earlier, and interpreted patterns with uncanny precision. These individuals gradually became recognized as guides, guardians in both physical and spiritual terms, whose perception shaped how entire tribes moved, reacted, and survived. The emergence of these figures marked the beginning of a deeper structure in tribal life, where survival was no longer just a matter of reacting, but also of listening to those who could feel what others could not. These early guardians did not see themselves as chosen, but others began to treat them as if they were. When they paused, the group paused. When they refused to cross a river or enter a silent forest, no one questioned the decision. Their ability to sense what was hidden became a source of trust, and with trust came responsibility. Over time, these individuals became the silent protectors of their people, not through physical strength, but through an awareness that bordered on the spiritual. They were the ones who noticed when the animals behaved strangely, when the air thickened with stillness, or when fire cracked in a tone that sounded unfamiliar. From this respect for heightened perception, the roots of spiritual leadership began to grow. These early guardians may not have spoken of spirits or gods, but the tribe began to treat their warnings as messages from something greater. The invisible world began to take shape in their minds, not as myth, but as memory and experience layered over countless generations. The guardians did not explain the source of their insight. They simply knew, and this knowing became sacred, passed down through subtle rituals, shared glances, and unspoken teachings in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. The concept of protection evolved. It was no longer only about hiding or fleeing. Protection now meant reading the signs before they became threats, preparing the group with silent adjustments, moving camp slightly to the west, avoiding water at certain times, sitting in circular formation around the fire instead of scattered. These choices were made through a kind of inner compass that the tribe began to honor. In moments when disaster was narrowly avoided, no one asked how the guardian knew. They simply accepted that something had spoken to them. And, slowly, these actions became stories. A mother who moved her child moments before a tree fell. A hunter who refused to go out on a morning that later revealed a predator's path. A clan that avoided a cave others entered, only to find signs of collapse the next day. These moments wove themselves into the group's memory, and with time, into their beliefs. The guardians became more than observers. They became bridges between the known and the unknown. Whether through dreams, sensations, or silent decisions, they helped keep their people alive. And as the sense of the unseen deepened, these protectors were no longer just members of the tribe. They became the first spiritual figures, living connections to forces that could not be seen but were undeniably felt. As night fell over the open landscapes of early Earth, the real test of survival began. During daylight, threats could at least be seen. Predators could be spotted. Storms approached from a distance, and human senses had the advantage of light. But in the dark, everything changed. Vision was no longer useful, and the safety of a tribe depended on preparation, positioning, and a deep relationship with the unseen. The early humans developed specific rituals to survive the night, not out of superstition at first, but out of patterns learned through trial and error over generations of terrifying losses. These nighttime rituals became the first coordinated efforts of spiritual protection, and they often meant the difference between waking up or being wiped out. The fire, for example, was never just a source of heat or light. It was placed in very specific ways. Sometimes two fires would be lit, one for illumination, the other for defense, meant to create illusions of movement. Ashes were spread around the camp not randomly, but as a kind of primitive alarm system. Any disturbance would leave a mark. Stones were stacked in symbolic formations, perhaps without full understanding, but these served to divide inside from outside, safe from wild. These were not yet spiritual symbols in the religious sense, but their function became sacred through repeated success. The group began to treat certain arrangements, behaviors, and even sleeping positions as acts of protection. Sounds also mattered. Some groups developed rhythmic humming or soft vocalizations through the night, not to communicate, but to project presence. These soft sounds told the darkness, "We are here, and we are aware." And just as, importantly, they told one another, "You are not alone." The placement of elders, warriors, and children within the sleeping circle was not random. It followed rules based on perceived vulnerability and strength. The most alert, or the most spiritually sensitive, were often placed at the periphery, like living sensors positioned to sense danger before it reached the core. The environment itself played a role. Camps were rarely placed near water at night, even if water was needed. Too many. Predators prowled those areas after sunset. If a place felt wrong, too still, too quiet, or heavy in some undefinable way, it was avoided, even if it offered shelter. This intuitive mapping of safe versus unsafe zones became encoded into the tribe's knowledge base. These decisions were passed down through behavior, not words. Children learned by watching where their parents sat, how they reacted to specific noises, and which directions were never slept facing. And over time, as these behaviors solidified, they began to carry a weight beyond logic. They became rituals. Even when conditions changed, the rituals stayed. Why? Because they were believed to work. And in a world where death waited just beyond the reach of firelight, Any behavior that brought one more dawn was worth repeating. These moments, so small, so human, form the backbone of our spiritual history. They reveal that long before gods had names, fear had meaning, and meaning created action. Have you ever felt that certain places, sounds, or gestures carry power beyond explanation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Whether it's something you've experienced or simply a feeling you've carried, your perspective adds to this journey. Among the countless elements that shaped the survival of early tribes, nature itself stood as both a threat and a guide. Long before there were names for weather patterns or explanations for animal behavior, early humans relied on subtle cues from their environment. They didn't simply observe nature. They interpreted it. They watched it as if it were speaking to them. The rustling of leaves wasn't just background noise, it carried information. The absence of birdsong wasn't silence, it was an alarm. Nature's voice became a system of early warnings, and these tribes learned to read it with astonishing clarity. It wasn't only predators that gave away their presence through minor disruptions. Wind direction, the quality of air, and even the smell of certain areas played into the tribe's perception of safety. A breeze that suddenly shifted direction could mean a large animal moving nearby. A change in humidity might warn of an approaching storm. These messages from the landscape were absorbed, stored, and passed on. The entire group adapted to this sensory decoding process, not through formal teaching, but through exposure and repetition. Children learned not to run through a quiet patch of forest. Hunters knew that a sudden stillness meant something had changed. The messages weren't abstract. They were immediate and essential. Animal behavior offered even clearer signals. When herds moved suddenly or birds took flight in unified waves, the tribes took notice. They didn't need to understand the reason. The reaction was enough to trigger caution. Over time, these moments formed patterns, and the patterns created a map of responses. This wasn't instinct in the biological sense. It was the result of deeply ingrained observational wisdom. One could say it was the first form of empirical science, a process of cause and effect drawn directly from the living world. Even the positioning of the sun and moon played a role. When light fell differently through the trees, when shadows formed in unexpected ways, when a familiar trail looked slightly distorted, these were moments of pause, and those pauses often saved lives. The tribes learned that nature's messages didn't always come with sound or movement. Sometimes they came with absence, an absence of sound, of wind, of scent, could signal something unnatural approaching. Their survival was built not just on action, but on restraint, knowing when not to move, when not to speak, and when to turn back without reason. This decoding of natural signals became part of the group's unspoken language. The tribe's ability to move silently through hostile terrain while interpreting these signs was not random. It was refined over generations. Each group carried its own set of understandings. What certain birds meant, which direction of cloud movement was dangerous, what kind of soil smell indicated a predator's lair nearby. These teachings were embedded into their collective behavior and treated with the same gravity as spoken warnings. In a world where no walls protected them and no written language offered guidance, nature became the first messenger, and those who listened became the ones who survived. This reverence for natural signs did more than protect them. It shaped their worldview. It positioned nature not just as a resource or an enemy, but as a presence, something to be heard, respected, and ultimately obeyed. Night in the prehistoric world was not simply the absence of light. It was the opening of a different realm, one ruled not by sight or reason, but by instinct and imagination. As darkness spread across the landscape, early humans entered a space where the familiar vanished. The trees became looming shapes, sounds became disembodied signals, and every shift in air could be either harmless or deadly. Within this silence, The mind awakened in ways that daylight suppressed. It began to listen more intently, to imagine more vividly, and to fear more deeply. And through that fear, an entirely new perception emerged, one that blurred the line between physical and spiritual experience. The silence of night was not empty. It was alive, filled with possibilities, threats, and unanswered questions. In that silence, the mind of early humans created meaning from patterns that had no clear origin. A rustling in the bushes was not just noise, it was a question. Was it the wind or something more? A flickering flame casting shadows against the cave walls became a moving shape, a presence. The human brain, always searching for context, began to interpret these uncertainties as messages. But these were not messages in a language of words. They came in sensations, gut reactions, waves of unease or sudden calm. And over time, these internal responses became just as important as external cues. For the first time, humans began to experience fear not only of what was out there, but of what they imagined could be. The mind, left in darkness without distraction, filled in the unknown with forms, some protective, others threatening. These forms would eventually evolve into spirits, ancestors, gods. But in these early moments, they were simply presences felt more than seen. The invisible took shape in their emotional reactions. A shiver down the spine, a refusal to sleep in a certain corner of the shelter, a sudden need to move the fire closer. These were the behavioral manifestations of a growing inner world. Children, especially, were sensitive to these shifts. They would cling more tightly during certain nights, even if nothing had changed in their environment. Parents learned to trust these reactions. They didn't dismiss them as fear or imagination. They respected them as signs. The belief slowly formed that certain minds, especially those of the very young or the very old, could perceive what others could not. This belief was not superstition in the modern sense. It was observation. It was survival. The internal landscape of early humans became just as important as the external one. They began to sense that what they thought, felt, or dreamed could have real consequences. A bad dream might be interpreted as a warning. A strong feeling of peace before sleep might be a sign of safety. And the more these internal cues aligned with reality, the more trust was placed in them. What we now call intuition was, for them, a form of communication, not with others, but with something deeper, perhaps with nature itself, or perhaps with something beyond it. These moments in the dark, where imagination fused with instinct, built the first bridges to spiritual belief, not through ceremony or doctrine, but through the raw experience of existing in a world that was vast, unpredictable, and alive in ways they could not fully explain. In that space, between silence and thought, the first foundations of the human spirit were quietly laid. Among the most powerful expressions of ancestral intuition was the way early humans protected their young. In a world with no fences, no medicine, and no margin for error, keeping children alive was a sacred act, shaped by every lesson learned the hard way. Parents relied on far more than physical shelter or proximity. They developed an acute sensitivity to subtle signals, those invisible warnings that seemed to emerge from nowhere, urging them to move a child, to stay awake longer, or to wait before entering a new area. These instincts weren't random. They were born of observation, repetition, and a quiet conversation with forces that could not be named. Mothers, especially, became attuned to patterns no one else noticed. The way a breeze shifted at night, the restless movement of animals, a stillness that didn't feel right. These signals created tension in the body, not always understood, consciously, but strong enough to lead to action. A child would be pulled closer, a fire fed just a little longer, or sleep delayed until something passed. Fathers, too, often paced the perimeter of camps, not from anxiety, but from a sense that the boundary between safety and danger was always moving. In this movement, they listened, not with their ears, but with something deeper. The tribe respected these reactions. When a parent acted on instinct, no one questioned the motive. If a mother refused to let her child sleep in a certain spot, the group adjusted. If a father insisted on changing location before sunrise, others followed. They knew that these decisions were often the difference between life and death. Over time, these patterns were remembered, not just the actions, but the sensations that led to them. The feeling of dread before a storm, the nausea that preceded a predator's arrival, the sense of being watched even when no eyes were visible. These emotional memories were passed down not through words, but through behaviors. Children learned them before they could speak, absorbing their parents' tension, their silence, their movements. Eventually, these survival instincts became spiritual understandings. The idea that a parent could receive a message from something beyond themselves became part of tribal belief. Perhaps it was the ancestors, watching from the unseen. Perhaps it was the earth itself, warning those who listened. But regardless of the explanation, the outcome was the same. Lives were saved by reactions that had no visible cause. This connection between the invisible and the protective helped shape the earliest forms of spiritual reverence. Children were not only protected physically, they were surrounded by invisible forces that guided the hands and hearts of those who loved them. And in this bond, between intuition, action, and something beyond explanation, a deep respect for unseen protection was born. As early human tribes moved across vast terrains, they were not simply wandering, they were listening. Each step, each pause, each new campsite was chosen not only by logic or necessity, but by a growing sensitivity to what the land communicated. Some territories felt safe. Others, though visually similar, provoked unease, and over generations these feelings solidified into an invisible map, one not drawn with symbols or borders, but with memory, sensation, and inherited caution. This map shaped migration paths, hunting routes, and spiritual boundaries. It was not just physical knowledge, it was emotional geography passed from one generation to the next. Some places, regardless of how fertile or sheltered they were, became known as no-stay zones. Perhaps there had been an unexplained death there. Perhaps the animals avoided it. Perhaps the wind never blew there in a natural way. The reason didn't need to be understood. What mattered was the pattern. When people ignored that instinct and stayed anyway, something went wrong. Over time, these areas took on a spiritual weight, not because of rituals or myths, but because of repetition. Survival stories began to attach to the land itself, and a form of territorial spirituality was born, not based on ownership, but on reverence and avoidance. Other places, by contrast, developed reputations for safety. Natural clearings where fires burned longer, where predators never seemed to venture, where water tasted better, or where children slept more peacefully. These zones became temporary sanctuaries, not because of any visible wall or force, but because something about them made people feel watched in a protective way. Perhaps it was how the trees moved, how the air carried sound, or the way the stars were more visible. These places were remembered, returned to, and eventually spoken of with a tone of respect. And in this pattern, early humans began to distinguish between places that welcome and places that warn. Even during travel, tribes carried this invisible map with them. Scouts moved ahead not just to look for food or shelter, but to feel the land. The quiet ones, those most attuned to this energy, were trusted to make decisions that affected everyone. Their word mattered, even if they couldn't explain it. "Not here," they would say, and the tribe would move on. No one asked why. The knowing was enough. Over time, these scouts became more than just pathfinders. They became interpreters of the Earth's voice, and through them, a new kind of relationship formed between human and land, one based on trust, response, and respect. This connection extended across generations. Children were taught not just to walk, but to feel where they walked, to notice how animals behaved in new areas, to remain quiet in unfamiliar places, listening before acting. These teachings created a form of environmental awareness that was not analytical, but deeply intuitive. The Earth was not a neutral space. It had moods, rhythms, and intentions. And those who lived longest were the ones who aligned with its guidance. Through these subtle teachings, early humans came to believe that movement through the world required more than physical endurance. It required spiritual sensitivity, a kind of listening that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with presence. And in this presence, the earth itself became a silent companion, sometimes welcoming, sometimes warning, but always communicating with those willing to receive. There were moments when the sky itself seemed to speak. To the early tribes who spent every hour under the open heavens, the sky was not merely a background. It was a living surface, a shifting canvas of signs and rhythms. Long before astronomy or written calendars, humans watched the moon, the stars, the clouds, and the changing colors of dawn and dusk as if they were messages sent from something beyond. These were not casual observations, they were acts of deep attention. And when something in the sky changed, even slightly, it often changed how the tribe moved, thought, or acted. The celestial world wasn't separate from the human one. It was interwoven, a source of warnings and wisdom that shaped their spiritual sensitivity. A full moon that rose too quickly, a sudden eclipse that turned day into night, a red glow that stained the horizon. Even something as subtle as the way stars shimmered differently on a certain night could provoke silence among the group. The skies had a language, and although the tribes couldn't decode it logically, they responded to it intuitively. These changes were not explained, they were felt. They could signal a time to move, a time to remain still, or a time to gather close, and when nothing unusual happened above, even that was considered meaningful. Stillness in the sky was just as powerful as disturbance. The tribes also understood how the land responded to the sky. A sudden stillness in the trees after a flash of lightning. Strange silence after thunder rolled across the plains. The way animals behaved during storms or how insects disappeared before a strong wind arrived. These patterns tied sky and earth together, creating a kind of spiritual bridge that early humans relied on. They didn't speak of gods yet, but they spoke of the way things move, and how sometimes the movement felt directed, as though something unseen had decided to send a message. At night, the stars became not just points of light, but companions. They marked direction, yes, but they also marked memory. Stories were tied to specific constellations, even if those stories had no names. When a particular star rose earlier than expected, or when a familiar shape in the sky vanished behind clouds for days, the elders noticed. The group adjusted. These shifts were seen as omens, not because they had detailed systems of belief, but because these patterns often coincided with events, an animal migration, a death, a birth, a storm. Over time, the tribe began to associate certain celestial behaviors with earthly consequences, and the stars became more than guides. They became warnings, reminders, perhaps even protectors. Sometimes the sky fell completely silent. No wind, no movement, no sound. In those moments, even fire crackled differently. The tribe would grow quiet, sensing something approaching. Was it danger? Was it a presence? No one knew for certain. But they respected the silence. They responded not with fear, but with preparation. A child would be brought closer. A song might be hummed. A fire might be moved just a few feet to the left. These were the smallest gestures, but they carried weight. They reflected an ancient belief that the sky was watching, and if one paid attention, it would speak. In these acts, early humans shaped a worldview where the sky was never empty. It was filled with signals, moods, and rhythms, and to live under it was to be in constant conversation with something vast, unknowable, and deeply connected to every heartbeat on the ground below. As centuries passed, these patterns of survival, based on perception, silence, and subtle responses, were no longer just reactions to the environment. They became embedded in the human spirit. The wisdom of interpreting the invisible, of trusting feelings that had no obvious origin, shaped not only how people lived, but how they understood existence itself. And while the world changed around them, new tools, new threats, new territories, the need for that invisible protection never faded. What began as instinct evolved into ritual. What began as a feeling became a belief. And what began as survival grew into spirituality. Even today, traces of that ancestral sensitivity remain within us. We feel uneasy in places that seem off, without knowing why. We dream of danger before we face it. We feel drawn to or repelled by people for reasons we can't explain. These are not superstitions. They are echoes. They are the distant voices of ancestors who once huddled around fires scanning the darkness, not just with their eyes, but with something deeper. The sense that something was watching, not to harm, but to guide. Modern life, with all its distractions and speed, tries to mute that voice. But it's still there. In the way we hesitate before making a decision. In the way we sense when something isn't quite right. In the way we pause before entering a room, or the way we're drawn to certain places for no logical reason. This is not just biology, it's memory. A memory passed through generations, shaped by thousands of years of survival. And though we may no longer walk barefoot across silent forests, the awareness that once saved us still pulses quietly beneath the surface. The first tribe survived not because they dominated their world, but because they respected it. They listened to the wind, to the ground, to the sky, to their own hearts. And in that listening, they built an invisible armor that carried them through cold, hunger, and fear. That same armor still exists. It just needs to be remembered. And if you've stayed with me until now, that probably means something inside you recognizes that connection. If that's true, write in the comments. That wisdom never left us. I'd love to know if you felt the same thread pulling through everything we explored. And if this message resonated with you in any way, go ahead and like the video. It helps more than you might imagine. Also, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so we can keep exploring these hidden layers of our shared human story together. There's another video right here that dives deeper into a forgotten aspect of our origins. Click it and come with me. We're just getting started.